December 15, 1943, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The winter air hung crisp and still over the pine forests of southern Mississippi as dawn broke across the prisoner of war camp. Steam rose from metal bowls filled with oatmeal, scrambled eggs, and bacon, more food than many of the Japanese prisoners had seen in a single meal during their entire military service. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto stared at the abundance before him, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he lifted the spoon. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of pine needles, creating an almost surreal atmosphere that seemed to mock everything he had been taught about his enemies. In the distance, a phonograph crackled to life, filling the barracks with the smooth melodies of Glenn Miller's orchestra. The sound drifted through the compound like a gentle invasion, penetrating the consciousness of men who had expected to die with honor on distant battlefields, not to find themselves surrounded by luxuries they could never have imagined. For Yamamoto and his fellow prisoners, this moment represented not just physical captivity, but the beginning of a profound psychological reckoning with truths their empire had desperately tried to conceal. The Japanese military machine of 1941 had launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor with supreme confidence, fueled by years of propaganda that painted America as a nation of soft, materialistic weaklings. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated to believe that Americans were racially inferior, spiritually weak, and industrially inadequate, a paper tiger that would crumble under the righteous fury of the emperor's forces. The average Japanese serviceman had been taught that American soldiers were cowards who would flee at the first sign of real combat, that American factories produced only luxury goods for a decadent society, and that the United States lacked the spiritual fortitude necessary for a prolonged war. This carefully constructed mythology served multiple purposes for Japan's militaristic leadership. It justified their aggressive expansion across the Pacific, provided moral cover for their brutal treatment of conquered peoples, and maintained domestic support for a war that would demand enormous sacrifices from the Japanese population. The typical Japanese soldier heading into battle carried with him not just weapons and equipment, but an unshakable belief in his own superiority and his enemy's fundamental weakness. They expected to face an opponent that would break easily under pressure, surrender quickly when cornered, and prove incapable of the sustained industrial effort necessary for modern warfare. These expectations were reinforced by Japan's early victories in the Pacific. The rapid conquest of the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and much of Southeast Asia seemed to confirm everything Japanese propaganda had promised. American and Allied forces appeared to crumble before the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, validating the narrative of Western weakness and Eastern strength. Japanese newspapers celebrated these victories as proof of their racial and spiritual superiority, while military leaders spoke confidently of dictating peace terms from the White House lawn. Yet even in those early months of triumph, cracks began to appear in the facade. Japanese soldiers advancing through captured American bases in the Philippines found warehouses filled with supplies that exceeded anything they had ever seen in their own military. Captured American positions revealed defensive works constructed with industrial precision and equipped with weapons of remarkable sophistication. Most disturbing of all, interrogations of American prisoners revealed not the cowardly weaklings of Japanese propaganda, but professional soldiers with high morale and unshakable confidence in their nation's ultimate victory. By late 1942, as American industrial production reached full stride and the tide of battle began to turn, more and more Japanese servicemen found themselves prisoners of war. The journey from capture to imprisonment was itself a revelation. Unlike the brutal treatment Japanese forces routinely inflicted on their prisoners, captured Japanese soldiers discovered that Americans adhered to international laws governing prisoner treatment. They were provided with medical care, adequate shelter, and food rations that often exceeded what they had received in their own military. The first shock came with the medical examinations. American doctors treating wounded Japanese prisoners displayed a level of professional competence and technological sophistication that contradicted everything these men had been told about American capabilities. X-ray machines, antibiotics, and surgical techniques far advanced beyond anything available to Japanese forces revealed an industrial and scientific capacity that Japanese propaganda had insisted did not exist. Wounded prisoners found themselves receiving better medical care as captives than they had ever received as soldiers in the Emperor's service. But the true revelation came with the food. The standard American prisoner of war ration included not just adequate calories, but variety and quality that seemed almost impossible to Japanese minds, conditioned by years of military deprivation. White bread, fresh meat, dairy products, vegetables, and fruits appeared on prison camp tables with a regularity that spoke to industrial and agricultural capabilities of staggering proportions. Japanese prisoners, many of whom had subsisted on rice, pickled vegetables, and occasional fish throughout their military service, found themselves confronted with evidence of American abundance that shattered their preconceived notions about their enemy's economic strength. Corporal Yamamoto, captured during the fierce fighting on Guadalcanal, later recalled his first meal in American custody. We had been told that Americans were starving, that their country was weak and poor. But here I sat, a prisoner, eating better food than I had ever tasted as a free man in the Emperor's army. The bread was soft and white, the meat was fresh and plentiful, and there were vegetables I had never seen before. I began to understand that everything we had been told was a lie. The psychological impact of this abundance extended far beyond mere nutrition. Japanese military culture had long emphasized the virtue of privation, teaching soldiers that suffering and sacrifice were essential elements of spiritual strength. The ability to endure hardship with stoic acceptance was considered a fundamental characteristic of the Japanese warrior spirit. To discover that their enemies not only avoided such privation but actually prospered, in its absence challenged core assumptions about the relationship between material comfort and military effectiveness. American guards and administrators seemed genuinely puzzled by Japanese prisoners' amazement at standard treatment and provisions. What seemed like miraculous abundance to Japanese eyes was simply normal American military logistics. The contrast revealed not just differences in material wealth, but fundamental disparities in industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and organizational efficiency. Japanese prisoners began to grasp that they had been fighting not just a different army, but a completely different kind of civilization. The revelation deepened when prisoners gained access to American entertainment. Motion pictures shown in camp recreation halls provided windows into American civilian life that contradicted every element of Japanese propaganda about their enemy's society. Hollywood films revealed American cities filled with automobiles, American homes equipped with modern conveniences, and American civilians enjoying luxuries that exceeded the wildest dreams of Japanese peasants and workers. The technical quality of the films themselves, the cinematography, sound recording, and production values demonstrated industrial and artistic capabilities that Japanese prisoners had been assured did not exist. Music proved equally revealing. American popular songs, broadcast over camp radio systems and performed by fellow prisoners with musical training, introduced Japanese captives to a cultural sophistication and emotional range that challenged stereotypes about American artistic poverty. The complexity of American jazz, the craftsmanship of Broadway show tunes, and the sheer variety of musical styles available to ordinary Americans painted a picture of cultural richness that contradicted Japanese propaganda about American spiritual emptiness. Private Kenji Nakamura, captured on Iwo Jima, later wrote about his exposure to American music. The songs were unlike anything I had ever heard. They spoke of freedom, of love, of hope for the future. The musicians among the American soldiers could play these complex melodies with ease, as if such sophistication was commonplace in their country. I began to realize that we had been told nothing true about these people and their civilization. The camp libraries, stocked with American books, magazines, and newspapers, provided additional evidence of American intellectual and industrial strength. Japanese prisoners with sufficient English language skills discovered American publications filled with technical articles, scientific discussions, and cultural commentary that revealed a society far more sophisticated and educated than Japanese propaganda had suggested. Popular magazines like Life and Saturday Evening Post contained advertisements for consumer goods that exceeded Japanese production capabilities, while technical journals discussed industrial processes and scientific discoveries that Japanese researchers could only dream of achieving. Perhaps most shocking of all was the casual efficiency with which Americans managed the prisoner of war camps themselves. The logistics of housing, feeding, and caring for thousands of prisoners while maintaining security and providing recreational activities demonstrated organizational capabilities that impressed even hardened Japanese military professionals. American administrators seemed to accomplish with ease what would have required enormous effort and resources in the Japanese system, revealing levels of institutional competence that contradicted fundamental assumptions about American character and capabilities. The symbolic power of a simple item, the American cigarette, became a recurring reminder of these revelations. Japanese prisoners had been accustomed to rough, poorly manufactured cigarettes when they were available at all, which was increasingly rare as the war progressed and Japanese supply lines stretched thin. American cigarettes, with their smooth tobacco, consistent quality, and attractive packaging, represented a level of industrial sophistication and quality control that extended far beyond military necessity. The fact that such luxuries were readily available to ordinary American soldiers and even to prisoners of war spoke to productive capabilities that Japanese propaganda had insisted were impossible for a democracy to achieve. As months passed in captivity, Japanese prisoners began to understand that they had been fighting not just a military enemy, but an entire civilization operating on principles and achieving results that their own leadership had assured them were impossible. The abundance they witnessed was not temporary wartime prosperity, but the normal output of an economic system that combined democratic governance with industrial capitalism in ways that Japanese fascist ideology claimed could never succeed. The transformation in Japanese prisoner attitudes was gradual but profound. Men who had entered captivity expecting to die with honor for the emperor found themselves questioning not just the conduct of the war, but the fundamental premises upon which their society was based. The comfort and dignity with which they were treated challenged assumptions about the necessity of authoritarian control, while the abundance they witnessed contradicted beliefs about the economic superiority of their own system. Letters written by Japanese prisoners, subject to censorship but still revealing, began to express doubts about official Japanese narratives. Corporal Yamamoto wrote to his wife, "The conditions here are better than what we experienced in our own barracks. The Americans treat us with a respect I did not expect, and their country appears to be far different from what we were told. I am beginning to wonder what other truths have been hidden from us." The impact of these revelations extended beyond individual prisoners to influence broader Japanese perceptions of the war and their enemy. As news of American prisoner treatment filtered back to Japan through carefully monitored communications and prisoner exchanges, it began to undermine domestic support for continued resistance. Japanese civilians, already suffering under increasingly severe rationing and bombing attacks, learned that their sons and husbands in American captivity were eating better and living more comfortably than they were at home. The educational programs offered in American prisoner of war camps provided additional opportunities for Japanese captives to encounter ideas and information that challenged their previous worldview. English language classes, American history lessons, and discussions of democratic principles introduced concepts that Japanese education had either ignored or actively opposed. The revelation that American soldiers were encouraged to think independently, question orders when appropriate, and maintain connections with civilian society contradicted Japanese military doctrine that emphasized blind obedience and the subordination of individual will to collective purpose. Technical training programs in the camps offered Japanese prisoners exposure to American industrial methods and technologies that revealed the true source of American military strength. Workshops on automotive repair, electronics, and manufacturing processes demonstrated production techniques and quality standards that explained how America could simultaneously equip its own forces, supply its allies, and maintain civilian prosperity throughout the war. Japanese prisoners trained as mechanics or technicians discovered that American methods were not just more efficient than their own, but based on fundamentally different approaches to problem-solving and resource utilization. The psychological impact of these discoveries created what American camp administrators recognized as a re-education process. Though it was largely unintentional and certainly unofficial, Japanese prisoners, confronted daily with evidence that contradicted their previous beliefs, began to develop new understandings of democracy, capitalism, and individual freedom. The process was particularly powerful because it emerged from direct observation rather than propaganda, making it far more convincing than any formal indoctrination program could have been. As the war progressed and American victories mounted, Japanese prisoners found themselves witnessing the very industrial and military capabilities they had been assured did not exist. Reports of massive American bomber formations, accounts of amphibious operations involving hundreds of ships, and descriptions of American forces simultaneously fighting in Europe and the Pacific revealed organizational abilities that Japanese military doctrine had claimed were impossible for democratic societies to achieve. The arrival of new prisoners throughout 1944 and 1945 brought fresh confirmation of American military strength. Japanese soldiers captured in the Philippines on Pacific Islands, and eventually in Japan itself, carried stories of American forces equipped with weapons, vehicles, and supplies in quantities that seemed almost limitless. The contrast with Japanese forces, increasingly starved of resources and reduced to desperate expedients, made clear which side possessed superior productive capacity. Personal relationships between Japanese prisoners and American guards and administrators provided additional insights into American character and values. The informal, egalitarian interactions that Americans took for granted challenged Japanese assumptions about the necessity of rigid hierarchical structures. American soldiers who treated prisoners with basic human dignity while maintaining necessary security demonstrated that respect for individual worth was compatible with military discipline and effectiveness. The recreational activities available in American prisoner of war, camps, sports competitions, musical performances, craft workshops, revealed cultural attitudes toward leisure and self-improvement that contrasted sharply with Japanese military emphasis on constant duty and sacrifice. Japanese prisoners discovered that Americans valued personal development, creative expression, and individual achievement in ways that their own system had taught them to suppress in favor of collective obligations. Religious freedom in the camps proved particularly significant for Japanese prisoners. While many maintained their traditional Buddhist or Shinto beliefs, they found themselves free to explore these faiths without government interference, and even to investigate Christianity if they chose. The absence of official religious doctrine and the tolerance for diverse spiritual beliefs demonstrated democratic principles in action, contrasting with the enforced emperor worship that had characterized their previous experience. As 1945 progressed and news of American bombing campaigns reached the prisoner of war camps, Japanese captives found themselves confronting the reality of their homeland's vulnerability. The industrial capacity that produced their daily abundance was simultaneously devastating Japanese cities and military installations. The same organizational efficiency that managed their comfortable captivity was systematically dismantling the Japanese war machine. The abundance they had initially seen as simple generosity revealed itself as the visible expression of overwhelming economic and industrial superiority. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki provided the final, decisive evidence of American technological capabilities. Japanese prisoners, learning of these weapons through camp communications, understood that they had been fighting an enemy whose scientific and industrial achievements exceeded their most pessimistic assessments. The fact that America possessed such weapons while simultaneously maintaining prisoner of war camps with recreational facilities and abundant food supplies demonstrated a civilization capable of both devastating warfare and humane treatment of enemies. Japan's surrender in August 1945 brought mixed emotions to Japanese prisoners in American camps. Relief at the war's end combined with shame at their nation's defeat and profound uncertainty about their future. Yet many had already begun the psychological transition from defeated enemies to potential friends. The treatment they had received, the abundance they had witnessed, and the ideas they had encountered had prepared them for a radically different relationship with America and the democratic values it represented. The repatriation process, beginning in late 1945 and continuing through 1946, sent tens of thousands of Japanese former prisoners back to their homeland, carrying with them transformed perspectives on America, democracy, and their own society. Their experiences in American captivity had provided them with first-hand knowledge of democratic institutions, capitalist economics, and individual freedom that would prove invaluable during Japan's post-war reconstruction. Many former prisoners became advocates for democratic reform in Japan, using their knowledge of American society to support the new constitution and political institutions imposed by the occupation authorities. Their testimony about American abundance and democratic values helped convince skeptical Japanese civilians that cooperation with the occupying forces offered genuine opportunities for national renewal rather than simply foreign domination. The symbolic power of that simple American cigarette, shared freely between former enemies, came to represent more than just material abundance. It embodied the democratic principle that prosperity and freedom were not zero-sum commodities to be hoarded by the powerful, but expanding possibilities that could be shared among all people willing to embrace the institutions and values that made such abundance possible. In the decades that followed, as Japan transformed itself into a democratic ally and economic partner of the United States, the experiences of Japanese prisoners of war in American camps became part of the foundation myth of the new Japan. Their stories of American abundance, democratic values, and humane treatment helped legitimize the profound changes that Japanese society underwent during the occupation and beyond. The irony was not lost on thoughtful observers that Japanese soldiers had learned more about American strength and values as prisoners than they ever had as enemies. The abundance that had initially shocked them as evidence of American materialism came to be understood as the natural result of freedom, democracy, and respect for individual dignity. The comfort they had experienced in captivity revealed itself as a glimpse of possibilities that their own authoritarian system had made impossible to achieve. The transformation of Japanese prisoners in American camps represented more than just individual conversions to democratic ideals. It demonstrated the power of abundance and freedom to overcome even the most deeply ingrained ideological convictions. Men who had been willing to die for emperor and empire discovered that they could live more fully as free individuals in a democratic society. The meals they had eaten, the movies they had watched, and the music they had heard had communicated truths about human possibility that no amount of propaganda could effectively counter. In the end, the abundance that Japanese prisoners encountered in American captivity served as both symbol and substance of democratic values. It was not simply the material prosperity that impressed them, but the implications of that prosperity for human dignity, individual worth, and collective possibility. The cigarettes, the movies, the abundant meals, and the casual efficiency of American administration all pointed toward a civilization that had discovered how to combine freedom with prosperity, individual rights with collective strength, and material abundance with spiritual values. The story of Japanese prisoners of war in American camps thus became a chapter in the larger narrative of democracy's triumph over fascism. It demonstrated that the values America fought to defend were not just abstract principles, but practical guidelines for creating societies where human beings could flourish. The abundance that had initially seemed like American weakness, the comfort, the luxury, the casual prosperity, revealed itself as evidence of a strength that fascist societies, for all their martial rhetoric and authoritarian discipline, could never hope to match. Years later, as former Japanese prisoners returned to visit the United States as free citizens of a democratic Japan, many would reflect on that first shocking encounter with American abundance in prisoner of war camps. They understood that what they had witnessed was not just material prosperity, but a glimpse of human possibility unleashed by freedom. The meals they had eaten, the movies they had watched, and the respect they had received had shown them that democracy was not weakness but strength, that abundance was not decadence but achievement, and that freedom was not chaos but the foundation of human dignity. The cigarette smoke that had drifted through those Mississippi barracks in 1943 carried with it the promise of a different world, a world where enemies could become friends, where abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, and where the democratic ideals of freedom and human dignity could transform even the most bitter adversaries into partners in building a better future for all humanity.